There's basically two ways that we make decisions. One is we use our intuition, our gut, right? We think this is the right choice, and therefore that's why we're going to go this route or take this plan. But then there's also database decision making, right? And in the modern era, there's more and more data. We want to make better decisions, and all of our governments and all of our businesses and everything is set up to gather that data and use it to make better decisions. But I'm here to talk about a problem that we have with that. We all want more data. We all want to make better decisions with that data. But there's a big problem, which is simply that data is increasing at such a fast rate. In a decade, it's going to increase by 16x. More and more data. It's overwhelming us. And there's good data. There's bad data. There's all sorts of information from different angles hitting us. It's harder than ever for us to actually know what's true or what we can take and put into that decision-making process. So this leads to something called information overload. It's a well-documented, scientific problem, which is that the more information that we have, the more cognitive capacity it takes in our brains, the harder it is to make better decisions. So more and more data is great, but ultimately, it's not actually about having more data to make better decisions. It's about refining that data and coming at and figuring out what is important. And once you know what's important, it's about communicating that data to other people, to other decision makers, to make your point, to get your story across so that other people understand what you're saying and so that they can buy into your story. So here's another way to think of it. If data are just all these random dots, and if we're able to categorize that data, if we're able to connect those dots so that we have insights, if we're able to action on it and start to gain wisdom, we're getting closer to making better decisions. But then ultimately, this last part, impact, that's what it's really all about. It's about making an impact, having decisions that, and communicating in a way that we can take, the data, find the most important point, and communicate it so that it makes an impact on your life, on your business, on your government, on your citizens. And that's what it's all about. So how do we make that impact? Well, for us, what we do is we take data and we visualize it in different ways that are really compelling. So we take data, a table such as this, and we turn it into something that's beautiful, something that people remember, something that people look at and they can intuit something about the world. So we call this data storytelling, and I'm about to get into a little bit of the history of it. Started with cave art a pretty long time ago, 40,000 plus years ago. And this is, kind of funny, but, when you go back and you look at the artifacts and you look at what we know about this time period, people were already data storytelling way back then. So cave art in these places where they find this, where they find these different pictures, it's stuff like, these hands represent how many people were in that tribe or society at that time. It's about a hunt. We went on a hunt, a successful hunt, and we, killed X amount of animals. So they were already telling these stories, and they were already communicating and leaving it for other people to find, all the way back here. There's also oral storytelling, or oral tradition, as it's called. And this is not really kind of what we think about when we talk about data storytelling today. We think more about sort of what I showed you before, the visualizations. But back then, let's put it this way: the oldest known oral tradition story that has been passed down that we know about is there was a volcano eruption, and Aboriginals in Australia passed this down from generation to generation to say, hey, this volcano over here, this could erupt at any given time, and it caused all kinds of chaos when it did. So that information got passed down and down and down by generation. So even though 300, 400 years in the future, people were able to say, hey, this volcano is bad news. And that's data that got passed down. So as I said, today we do this all a little bit differently. It's charts, it's data visualizations, it's motion graphics or interactive work, or infographics, as we would like to call them. And so we're taking data and we're storytelling in a visual way that's compelling and captures hearts and minds. So what is data storytelling by definition? We think it's the combination of three things. We think it's a combination of narrative, which is the story. It's the combination of visuals, which is the part that is the compelling part that everybody likes and it captures people's attention. And then, of course, it's also the data. The data has to go in there as well. The data is, I would say, the hardest part. As I mentioned before, there's so much of it, and processing it and coming up with the most pertinent and interesting portions of it can do wonders for data storytelling. It seems like, at least when we work with a lot of people on this, they focus on the visuals, and the visuals are important, but the data is the hardest part, is dissecting all of that data and breaking it down and finding what is compelling from that data and cleaning it and finding what is the most interesting insight that we can pull that we can use in our data storytelling. The narrative is another really important part, obviously, because if you just have data and you show that to someone, they're probably not going to care. But if you combine it into a story, then all of a sudden it makes a big difference. And as we told you, stories have been passed down from humans for thousands and thousands of years. And so this is a native form of understanding for us. So having the story is really important. And so I have here the hero's journey, which is a famous it's a famous mode of storytelling that if you've ever watched certain movies, whether it's The Matrix or Star Wars or whatever, they all follow this exact same pattern with the hero. And not to say that you should use data and put it into some hero's journey type matrix, but there are different ways and conventions that we can use in storytelling, which we've used for, again, humans have done for thousands of years. There are certain conventions that we can use when we're telling stories that are very effective. And then lastly is the visuals, and I actually think that this is probably the easiest part if you are able to nail the other two things. If you're able to get the other two things, the narrative and the data, coming up with the actual visuals is easier than you would think. And here are just some of the ways that we can do it. It's all the charts that you know, and sometimes it's combining these things together. And you combine the three things together, and you have data storytelling. So here's one last way of thinking of it. These are Legos. I'm sure you're familiar. Data is a pile of Legos that's completely unorganized. We can sort that. We can put it into different colors. We can arrange it. We can start to group it by colors, and then we can present it visually. And now we're starting to make sense of that. But then we add a story to it, and all of a sudden, that colored data, all of a sudden it means so much more. Now it's a house, or now it's a building, and that's so much more powerful than just having the bars of color. So that's really what this is all about. It's about taking that pile of Legos and turning it into something that people look at and they say, I get what you're talking about it. And from a decision-making point of view, they understand the argument and they're able to process it in a world with so much information overload. Okay, so this is usually a longer part of my presentation, but I'm going to whip through this really fast, just the most important things that we think about when we're data storytelling. This is the number one thing. This is a guy named Seth Godin. He's a master marketing mind. He talks about in the information economy that there are two currencies, and often you can trade them for one another, and often people do make the decision to trade them for one another. So there's attention and there's trust. Attention is you get someone's attention and you say, hey, look at me, look at my story, and then you have to keep their attention, obviously, right? On the other side of the equation is trust, which is if you're not able to maintain someone's trust, then they're not going to believe your story. So the funny thing in modern society is that we're often trading these two for one another. So if you think about clickbait headlines in the media, what they're doing is they're trading their trust to get your attention now. But that doesn't work in the long run. So how do you maintain both of these things at the same time? You have to be both interesting and you have to get people's attention. You have to keep people's attention. But then at the same time, you have to maintain their trust while you do that. And so we think a lot about this, and we think data storytelling is really a way that you can maintain both of these at the same time. And our website gets 10 million visits every month because people they trust it, but it's also attention grab. It's also interesting to them. Utility equals meaning divided by time. This is just simple. The utility that you get out of information, that you get out of data storytelling, that you get out of something that is produced, the visualization, is simply the meaning that you get from it divided by the amount of time that you spend looking at it. It's a very simple equation, but all of us, when we're expressing ourselves or telling our stories, we're sometimes adding in too much information. We're not respecting the people's time. We're diluting this utility equation. Here's another thing, is that the way that you interpret data is different from how everybody else interprets data. There's a bunch of factors that play here, but a couple that I'll talk about. We all have different contexts, so we all have learned different data leading up to the point that we're absorbing the data that you're now telling me. And because of that, it means that we all have different perspectives when we interpret the exact same data. One other thing that can factor into that is the experience. We all have different experience. A doctor that's looking at data is going to have a different interpretation than a lawyer that's looking at the data, who's going to have a different interpretation than a politician or an entrepreneur. We all have different experience in life, whether it's professional experience or personal experience. That's going to lead us to all interpreting data in different ways. Data literacy is another one, which is simply that people have different abilities in terms of how they are able to understand data. Some people are very basic in that category, and you can't present something too complex to them. Other people are very sophisticated there, and they're going to be able to process even the most complicated data storytelling. Lastly, cognitive biases are another thing to think about. There's over 200 cognitive biases that we know of out there, and so this affects people's decision making. It affects their understanding of the world. One I really like, and I think that's really relevant, and especially relevant to the summit, is called the curse of knowledge. And if you haven't heard of the curse of knowledge, it's for me the most interesting cognitive bias, which is basically that the deeper that someone is in a field, the more that they know about something. So if you think of like a physicist that's been in their field for 40 years, the harder it is for them to relate to the person that knows nothing about physics. And what that means is that they have trouble explaining the very most basic things about physics because it's their language, it's what they've spoken for 40 years, and it's hard for them to go back and explain like you're 5 years old to someone. And so we all run into this problem. All of us who are deep in our fields, we all suffer from this, which is how do we communicate with something that knows not much about what we're talking about? And the last thing I'll just quickly point out is that just because you have data doesn't mean that it's a story and doesn't mean that it means anything. It's just data is, there's so much of it, and I can pass you a spreadsheet and you might not get anything from it. So we have to clean it, we have to refine it, we have to figure out what is pertinent, we have to figure out what is the actual insight that we're looking at, and then we have to figure out how to communicate that. So this is the fun part now where I get to go through all the cool visuals that we do. And so I'm going to go through this pretty fast, but you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about, and you can always go to our website to find more. So how do we stand out? Context is king. So this is the Titanic. How big was the Titanic? Well, here's the world's biggest cruise ship today. All of a sudden, you have a sense of perspective on how big the Titanic is. There's the iceberg. There's a plane. There's all these items, and now all of a sudden, you have the context and you can actually understand what we're talking about. You have to connect the dots for people. That's really effective. So this visualization just shows every country's largest trading partner. Do you see a trend? Yeah, there's only a couple of them that all of the countries are linked to. We're literally connecting the dots here, but also we're conveying a point super fast. When you look at this, you say, holy crap, China, or Germany, or US, and you look at it, you see right away a story. Make it topical. So in November of 2022, the world hit 8 billion people. That's a pretty good story. So what did we do is we created a visualization of where all those people live. And so we broke it down by continent and country, and you can look at this, it's called a Voronoi diagram, and you can see exactly where everybody lives. And that's very relevant at that time because that's what was topical. That was in the news, that's what people were talking about, and that's why this has millions of views. Do the unexpected. So I'm not one of those people that's going to say, hey, every time you're data storytelling, tell it with a boring chart. We like to try different stuff. We like to do stuff that's interesting, and sometimes it fails dramatically. But this is one that didn't. Some of you may have seen this, but we published this in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic. And the artist that we were working with on our team had the idea of what if they were inspired by the COVID spike protein kind of style thing. What if we visualize all of these different pandemics as giant spike protein balls? And we were like, okay, like, sure. And so this has 15 million views. People love this thing. And it's totally against a lot of data visualization principles, but because it does that is why it works. So sometimes you have to venture off and you have to paint outside of the lines. You have to do something different, and that's what's going to capture people's attention and get them excited. And again, it's a world of attention, a world of attention and trust. Keep it simple. So in this, every year, our team goes through 500 plus podcasts and reports and presentations, and we sum up all of the predictions that all of the experts put together on what's going to happen in the following year. So that's a lot of work. But what do we produce? We just produce this simple table with it. We group all of the predictions together in a giant database, and we confine them down into the most common predictions. We call this our prediction consensus. And this is a lot of work and a lot of data that goes into this, but it's a very simple output, which is this kind of nondescript bingo board. And all we're doing is just punching a dot every time an expert has a prediction in that category. But when you look at it, you can see exactly what experts thought and what they agreed upon and what they thought is going to happen in 2023. Sometimes you have to answer the question that everybody has, but they don't know to ask. And so this is the Earth's surface. We're showing what is made up of water and then the different countries and how much they make up of the surface. And for some reason, we all know that the ocean is 2/3 or whatever. But when you visualize it like this, you're like, okay, yeah, there's not a lot of landmass there. And people were very surprised, and people thought this was very interesting. Be impartial to buy credibility. So this is an interesting one. I'm a big fan of being neutral. I like taking data and I like showcasing the story, and I don't like adding a spin to it. Ideally, I like to say, hey, here's the information, take from it what you will. And by taking stuff and not putting a spin on it, it makes a big difference. And so what we did here is, this is the length of the terms of services, or the terms of use for all these different services. And so, TikTok or Amazon, when you're signing up for something, this is what you have to read through, and everybody skips. But we looked at the size of all of them, and we just visualized them. We didn't say, oh, Facebook is really long, or LinkedIn is really onerous, or anything like that. We just said, hey, here's all the brands, here's how long they are, and you can look at it and come up with your own meaning out of it. But that buys you credibility, right? Because you're not spinning it in a particular way. Colors tell the story. We all know that color can be powerful, but when you look at this map, you can see right away there's a takeaway, right? The takeaway is how young Africa is when you're looking at median age. So this is the median age of all countries, or all continents. And so color is really powerful in this instance. You can see Europe, for the contrast between Europe and Africa. And if you use color the right way, it can do all of the work for you, and you can tell the story really fast and really powerfully. There's something familiar about this, and you might not know what it is, but I'll point it out, which is that it's the Great Lakes that are already basically organized in the setting, but then you add these are the world's largest lakes, by the way, and then you add all of the other lakes to the mix, and it seems familiar because the Great Lakes are still in there, and they're still looking like they would normally look, but then you add in all these other lakes, and all of a sudden it's familiar, but it's different, and so you're wondering, that familiarity helps provoke a response from you, but at the same time, you're learning something different. Have clear takeaways. So where are the next 1,000 babies going to be born? Here. What's the takeaway here? Well, I think there's a couple of clear ones, but I think when you look at this, you realize not a lot in the Americas, a lot in Africa, a lot in India, a lot in Pakistan and China. Very clear. Sometimes we're literal with things. A lot of data viz people don't like that. But what we do sometimes is we make something very literal. This is the world's largest natural gas producers, by the way. And then be memorable. And so this is all of the metals mined in the last year. And we visualized it in 3D. And when you look at it, it is very memorable. You can see the giant stack of iron ore, which is what we use to make steel and things like that. And then you can see everything from gold. Gold is down here in this tiny little corner. You can see uranium and chromium and copper, but having it all in perspective of the size of how big all they are is very memorable. Not many people take that approach, but if you take the time and you do something that's memorable, it can be really powerful as well. And that's it. So thank you for attending, and appreciate it.